All righty, welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn series here with the School of Theology. My name is Mary Catherine Alexander. I am your host today for this Lunch and Learn. I am here with Father Richard Cogill, and we are happy to have you here. I'm going to do a brief introduction of Father Cogill, and then we will hand it over to him, and he will go through his topic for the day. Father Cogill, South African by birth, is an Episcopal priest from the Diocese of Minnesota. He is a teacher, a community organizer, and a pastor. Prior to his current position, he taught in the Department of Theology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Additionally, he assisted at the Episcopal Parish of St. Andrew in Moose Lake, Minnesota. Before that, he served as the Dean of Studies for the Anglican Archiepiscopal Diocese of Cape Town and occasionally lectured in the Department of Theology at the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. He also served as the precentor at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town. He has extensive experience in the NGO sector, having served as a senior associate with the Collective Leadership Institute based in Germany, a senior associate for the Leadership Support and Development Center, director of Community Healing Network, and coordinator of the German South African NGO, South Africa and AIDS. Father Cogill has traveled to more than 30 countries and has lived in the US for 20 years, completing his bachelor's degree in English literature at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota, his STM and his DAS at General in New York, and he is currently a doctoral student in Cape Town, South Africa. He has taught in the United States, Palestine, South Africa, and South Korea. So that is our introduction of Father Richard Cogill, and I'm going to hand it off to him. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all. I cannot see who's zoomed in, and whenever I hear these introductions, it feels like my obituary that people read at my funeral. And oftentimes you have to have your credentials in terms of what makes you worthy of the presentation. Our presentation today is around restorative justice, and I will focus particularly on the theological imagination of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was instrumental in fostering and leading South Africa into a very difficult time in its history. So I will begin by giving you just a little brief sketch about the context in which this took place, and then the process of, Archbishop Tutu's theological imagination and how that influenced the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then some of the challenges of this particular approach in South Africa. So, on April 27th, 1994, voters stood for hours in the queue, often stretching almost a mile long, to vote in South Africa's first democratic election. And the long wait when voting was finally open to all South Africans in 1994, residents of the Black Township in Soweto turned out in force, and around 20 million South Africans queued for over 4 days of voting with an 86.9% voter turnout. And at the heart and at the groundwork that was set for this particular miracle in South Africa was the work of Archbishop Tutu and his ministry. So Tutu was the moral conscience of South Africa and was respected across political parties, and as such he was in a unique position to hold this space of transformation. When Tutu became the leader of the South African Council of Churches and later Archbishop of the Anglican Diocese of Cape Town, he became for many the most tangible example of that hope and that long fight against oppression. And he was the moral compass of the nation who cheered and cajoled us along the Pilgrim's Way, reminding us constantly of not what is, but what is possible. And so he embodied the dream of God, and in his very personhood, God was made manifest. And so the distinction between the political and the theological and spiritual is blurred in the South African context as he then takes the central stage of our social transformation. During his Nobel lecture, Tutu declared that unless we work assiduously so that all of God's children, our brothers and sisters, members of our one human race, all will enjoy basic human rights, the right to a fulfilled life, the right of movement, of work, the freedom to be fully human with a humanity measured by nothing less than the humanity of Jesus Christ himself, then we are on the road inexorably to self-destruction, and we are not far from global suicide. And then he has this imagination that things could be different when we learn that human beings are of infinite value because they have been created in the image of God, and that it is a blasphemy to treat them as if they were less than this, and to do so ultimately recoils on those who do this. In dehumanizing others, they are themselves dehumanized, and perhaps oppression dehumanizes the oppressor as much as, if not more than, the oppressed. They need each other to become truly free, to become human. We can be human only in fellowship, in community, in koinonia, and in peace. So he concludes, let us then work to be peacemakers, those giving a wonderful share in our Lord's ministry of reconciliation. And if we want to want peace, so we have to be told, let us work for justice, let us beat our swords into plowshares. So everything for Tutu begins with his particular theological predilection and his theological imagination. So the dismantling of decades of segregation was brought about by a complex mix of protest and sanctions from church, government, and businesses around the world. And in the minds of some, this was an absolute miracle, a literal dream come true. But what would the future hold after the dream of liberation was realized? In South Africa, which endured decades of some of those most severe and systemic oppression on the planet, the fight for freedom has come about without a civil war and without a coup. And instead, a series of negotiations in the early 1990s led to the complete dismantling of hundreds of laws which made up the apartheid system. And all the statutes, which had for decades denigrated and humiliated blacks, were abolished. A new constitution was adopted, and in 1994, free elections were held in which black South Africans were allowed to vote for the first time. And as a result, Nelson Mandela, who had once been sentenced to life of hard labor in a prison on Robben Island, was elected as South Africa's first black president. And so liberation was achieved, but this was not the end of the story. A pernicious legacy remained, and the road forward was unclear because no one had yet traveled this new path. And the questions that we had to ask ourselves as a country was, how was South Africa to redress the wrongs of the past? What was the appropriate way for the minority white ruling class to be punished? How could victims of apartheid avoid becoming the oppressors in the new South Africa? And could blacks and whites live harmoniously in what they called the Rainbow Nation? So Desmond Tutu, who was the first black archbishop in Cape Town, was in a unique position to judge and to guide us through this course of reconciliation. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize for the work he did to end apartheid, and now he was in charge with helping to chart a course which would lead to peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation for all. And 2 years after he was elected as president, Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu asked Desmond Tutu to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's important to note that the goal of the commission was not to prosecute every apartheid-era crime, a task that would have been impossible and perhaps even counterproductive. Instead, members of government, soldiers, and police and private individuals were offered potential amnesty if they would candidly and completely disclose their crimes to the commission. The TRC, as it was known, provided a forum for victimized South Africans and their families to tell their stories. And so the stated goal of the TRC was restorative rather than retributive. The Truth and Reconciliation process pivoted around Archbishop Tutu's understanding of forgiveness, an understanding that's quite different from the way in which Western theologians had typically defined it. Tutu believed that justice is merciful and that God desires the healing of relationships more than God desires punishment for a wrongdoer. And when conflict arises, nothing matters more than the restoration of a broken relationship. So for Tutu, forgiveness and reconciliation are two entirely distinct movements on the path to a restored relationship. Forgiveness is in the power of the one who is violated, and as such, it does not require an apology. Forgiveness is not extended for the benefit of the wrongdoer, but for the empowerment of the violated one. And because the violator's wrongdoing is an expression of coercive power, Tutu believes that to withhold forgiveness until one hears an apology is to yield power over again into the hand of the perpetrator. Therefore, to grant forgiveness is a means of ending the abusive cycle. Forgiveness is a means of saying, I am taking my power back. Reconciliation, by contrast, is sometimes a long and assiduous process to restore mutual trust once a violation has occurred. Reconciliation, unlike forgiveness, will require an apology, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and something that an offer of forgiveness can sometimes elicit. So when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission began, victims were given an opportunity in exchange for the possible freedom. Victims were given an opportunity to publicly tell their stories and then to seek redress. Perpetrators were also given an opportunity, and in exchange for the possibility of freedom, a clear conscience, and perhaps forgiveness from God, from both God and from their fellow citizens, offenders were offered the chance to publicly and comprehensively detail their crimes, to explain their role in the oppression of South Africa's Black majority, and to apologize to their victims and their victims' family. The choice for reconciliation over vengeance is deeply tied to the South African notion of Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is a complex word and a broad concept which relates to compassion and empathy. Tutu explains this Ubuntu as the idea that my humanity is caught up and inextricably bound to your humanity. It implies that I am only a person because of other persons. So according to Tutu, Ubuntu describes a person who is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed or treated as if they were less than who they truly are. He did, however, publicly wonder, did the methods of the TRC encourage people to think that they could commit crimes without knowing, while knowing that they would get amnesty? So he asked of South Africans, is it ever enough for perpetrators merely to apologize and to be humiliated through public explore, What about justice? And since amnesty expunged the civil and criminal liability of the successful applicant, was it fair to deny victims their constitutional right to claim civil damages from perpetrators and the state? So he was not being naive. He recognized the difficulty of his particular approach to restorative justice, and not everybody accepted his particular approach. So Tutu then offers some answers to such quandaries when he argued that when we dehumanize other people, we dehumanize ourselves as well. And he was very adamant about this notion. So he wrote, thus, to forgive is indeed the best form of self-interest, since anger and resentment and revenge are corrosive to that summum bonum, the greatest good, that communal harmony that enhances the humanity and personhood of all in the community. So for Desmond Tutu's, when he speaks of the highest good, this is not just a trite platitude about being nice to one another. This is a philosophy which proposes that the good life and life itself is impossible when we do not acknowledge and support the humanity and worth of everyone around us, not least our enemies or our adversaries. And he acknowledges that Ubuntu is not necessarily an instinctive human reaction, and he cannot determine or explain why some of us exhibit benevolent characteristics and others do not. And he cites the Rwandan genocide as an example of revenge and greed, which are overwhelming human impulses. As the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was being organized, it was decided that the traditional criminal trials would be impossible, since in many cases the only surviving witnesses to such crimes were the perpetrators themselves. Untold numbers of Black South Africans had been murdered in secret at police stations or by covert government assassinations, and their families desperately wanted information about how and why their loved ones had disappeared. What many South Africans wanted most of all was not punishment, but restorative justice. And Tutu argued that it is only in acknowledging our culpability and responsibility that humanity can progress and create a better world for all. So though the TRC was not actually a church tribunal, Archbishop Tutu's method and outlook was significantly influenced by his theological background, by his theological predilection. And in this regard, he made a subtle but important distinction between the sin and the sinner. The TRC had to recognize that the atrocious wrongs of apartheid were committed by humans rather than monsters. However bad the sin, such sin did not define the sinner. First, even perpetrators were regarded as God's children, worthy of both compassion and respect. Second, and perhaps most importantly, their very humanity meant that perpetrators could not be dismissed as simply depraved demons. They committed very human crimes and were therefore moral agents with free will who were fully and solely responsible for their own actions. And since they were in fact human and not monsters, they retained the capacity to feel remorse, to do penance, and to achieve a measure of redemption. And he insisted that Christians are constrained by the imperative of the gospel, the good news of a God who has a bias for sinners, contrary to the normal standards of the world. Therefore, in Tutu's eyes, there was no one who was irredeemable, and there are hopeful prospects for each one of us. God's love is eternally available to all, even those who have strayed and strayed for far too long. And it must be said, though, that Tutu did not consider the guarantee of such love to be an invitation to tolerate sin, because love is even more demanding than the strictures of the law. The TRC demonstrated quite clearly to Desmond Tutu that ours is a moral universe, and as he said, good and evil are really all that matters. Within the Christian imagination, the resurrection of Jesus Christ proved that death is not stronger than life, and evil is not more powerful than goodness. And in Tutu's imagination, the end of apartheid then reaffirmed that Christ's victory was real and that God's will was not for God's children to suffer. Many believed that apartheid would never end and that the crimes of apartheid state would remain hidden and that white minority would continue to govern. But Tutu never lost hope or took such a dim view of his country's prospects. At the height of apartheid violence and long before 1990, Tutu's confidence in God's will allowed him to proclaim, "The upholders of apartheid have already lost." And this was not just a figment of his imagination, but a reality in which he found himself, in which he lived and moved and breathed every single day. He noted that those who upheld South Africa's pigmentocracy, skin pigment aristocracy, were especially culpable since they claimed to be devout Christians and indeed defended their racial ideology on scriptural grounds. White Afrikaners primarily belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church, and this church fully supported the notion of separate development for the different South African races. And to justify this position, the Dutch Reformed Church relied on the Genesis account of God, confusing languages of a united people and dispersing them across the face of the earth so that they could cooperate and build the tower. They could not cooperate and build the Tower of Babel. The Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa considered the development of separate races to be a direct result of the confusions of tongues at the Tower of Babel. And according to this perspective, it was therefore God's intent to create racial groups, and God approved of segregated racial development. The Dutch Reformed Church argued that though all of humanity would be united in heaven, on this earth it would be appropriate for blacks to be confined to homelands so that they would not come into regular contacts with white. Desmond Tutu countered that such logic, by reasoning that since we are all made in the image of God, to treat a fellow human being as inferior is indeed to show contempt for God. And Tutu's perspective, which was shared by so many, meant that the opposition to apartheid was motivated more by faith rather than politics. His own church outside Johannesburg was demolished when the black township of Munseyville was declared a white area. And despite all these injustices, many South Africans retain a sense of their own dignity and their unique and God-given ability to help transform the policies which had corrupted their homeland. Malusi Mpolwana, who was the leader of the South African Council of Churches, remembers that when he was being tortured by police during the darkest days of apartheid, he said to himself, "These are God's children, and yet they are behaving like animals. They need us to help them recover the humanity that they have lost." Despite the varying opinions on the value of the TRC, and commission's hearing were followed quite avidly by the whole of the South African public. Unlike all previous criminal and civil trials in South Africa, the proceedings of the TRC were broadcast live on television and radio to large audience. And after a year and a half of public hearings and heart-wrenching testimony, Tutu said that no one in South Africa could ever again be able to say, "I did not know," and hope to be believed. The spirit of reconciliation has deep roots in South African churches. Many of the political prisoners on Robben Island, who later became leaders of the country, were educated at schools established by the Christian missionaries. And the magnanimous positions they adopted after 1994 were deeply infused with the Christian values they learned in the schools and in their churches. And the influence of Christian leaders was all the greater because so many priests and pastors and bishops were arrested and detained or exiled when they attempted to resist the worst aspect of apartheid. Human rights abusers had a strong incentive to fully comply with the demands of the TRC, and those who denied responsibility or who had failed to fully disclose the nature of their crimes did indeed face severe criminal penalties. Those who were forthright about their offenses were, in many cases, offered amnesty. The TRC has been highly praised and also criticized. Efforts at reconciliation could never heal all the wounds or right all the wrongs. And when South Africa achieved its liberation from racist bondage, hard choices had to be made and continued to be made regarding the conflicting needs for truth and peace, justice, atonement, and compensation. And this process toward peace and rapprochement began on April 27, 1994. Desmond had expressed his excitement when he awoke, knowing that he would be able to vote for the first time at the age of 62. But he also felt a sense of trepidation, knowing that the possibility of disruptive violence was very real. And in the days and weeks before the polling stations had opened, a right-wing paramilitary group had carried out bombings across the country, threatening to carry out even more. And Chief Buthelezi of the Inkatha Freedom Party had been waging a tragically violent struggle against their black rivals of the African National Congress. So Tutu left his home early in the morning to vote in the squalid black townships in the desolate area of Cape Town known as the Cape Flats. And it was ironic that as Archbishop, he had been living illegally in the official Archbishop's residence for years. His home in Bishop's Court was located in a wealthy and exclusively white area in Cape Town, which blacks were not legally allowed to enter without a permit issued by the government. Tutu never sought or received the necessary permission and came under heavy criticism and the threat of imprisonment. Like everyone else on that day, Tutu was forced to wait in what seemed like an endless long lines at the polling stations. Thousands of people who had never voted before stood in the hot sun for hours. There were too few ballots for such a large turnout, so more had to be printed and distributed, and this necessitated even longer waiting times, which people were quite happy to do. Tutu considers this a realization of what he and other clergy for so long had been preaching, that we are all created in the image of God, and that superficial differences of race and color were just that, cosmetic details of no importance. The goodwill experienced by blacks and whites, many of whom were standing among one another for the first time, were also evidence that blacks did not, in fact, wish to drive all white people into the sea, as was the narrative, and which so many white South Africans had feared for generations. There was a physical and spiritual transformation for both blacks and whites on that day. Blacks who had been minimized, traumatized, and legally erased from public affairs and public life emerged from the voting booth more fully human as full citizens of the land of their birth. White South Africans were also transformed, and the actions of the day removed some of the guilt and shame associated with the unjust privileges that they had for such a long time enjoyed. Tutu, until his dying day, argued that whites could not be truly free unless blacks were also free, and that blacks could not truly be free unless whites were also free. After the election, he insisted that a new transformed society could not be built without full cooperation of the black majority and the white minority. Keep in mind that blacks make up roughly 90% of South Africa's population, and whites account for less than 10% of that same population. So barely 2 weeks after the first multiracial elections, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first black president. Over 30 years before this momentous event, he had been convicted of plotting to overthrow the apartheid government and was sentenced to life in prison. And before his sentence, Nelson Mandela delivered a 3-hour speech in which he lamented the use of violence as an appropriate tool against oppression. But he argued that the white government had prohibited him and all black people from engaging in peaceful protest and non-violent resistance. The choice of the armed resistance was therefore made reluctantly solely, he said, because the government had left us with no choice. But decades later, in an effort at reconciliation, Mandela actually invited the white jailer who had guarded him for years to be present at his inauguration. So at this juncture of our freedom, the question was then asked, Nuremberg or national amnesia? The end of apartheid was by no means the end of South Africa's trauma. Freedom had been achieved, but a complex legacy of violence and injustice remained. And the apartheid government was responsible for many human rights abuses, but resistance movements and militant black political parties also had blood on their hands. In the 1960s Sharpeville massacre, 69 peaceful demonstrators were murdered by the state when they were protesting the passed laws. During the Soweto uprising, the white Afrikaner government had required black students to be taught in the Afrikaans language, even though it was not their mother tongue. In 1976, tens of thousands of students in Johannesburg Township protested against this policy, and in response, the police began shooting into the crowd of unarmed students, killing more than 100 and injuring thousands. And those incidents were well publicized, but many other black South Africans died quietly and anonymously in police custody when they were deemed a threat to the state. And ironically, such dehumanizing violence was also practiced by black South Africans who were fighting against apartheid. Blacks were suspected of colluding with the white government, were sometimes lynched in a process known as necklacing, and the necklace was actually a tire placed around a victim's neck. The necklace would be filled and doused with gasoline, and they would be set on fire. And the victim would then slowly and agonizingly burn to death in front of an approving crowd of onlookers. In addition to its use as a punishment for informants and spies, necklacing was also practiced by rival liberation movements, sometimes because of petty tribal or personal conflicts, other times due to sharp disagreements over which tactics would be most successful to establish the black majority rule. The ANC, the political party which primarily advocated for reform through nonviolent methods of resistance, also had a military wing known as the Spear of the Nation. And in 1983, this group attacked the officers of the South African Air Forces with a car bomb. The subsequent explosion killed more than 20 people, including civilians. So Desmond Tutu and others recognized that this violent past needed to be confronted if South Africa was ever to heal from its self-inflicted wounds. Many different methods for achieving justice were then proposed. After World War II, the victorious Allied powers established the Nuremberg trials to prosecute the war crimes committed by the leaders of Nazi Germany. And this type of victor justice was not seen as viable in South Africa, since there were not a clear victor when apartheid ended. There had been no civil war and no political revolution. Apartheid ended as a result of years of negotiation. There was a sense that any trial could not be imposed by one group over the other, and so instead, agreements and concessions would be required from both sides. So there was a rejection of a Nuremberg type tribunal, and it had practical motivation. The white military apparatus had participated in the negotiations which had ended apartheid, and it is unlikely that the military would have peacefully laid down their arms or relinquished their authority if they knew they would later be imprisoned or executed when blacks came to power. So for a peaceful transition to occur, careful compromises had to be made. And many commentators, both in South Africa and abroad, complained bitterly that such compromises meant that many perpetrators of human rights abuses would never face justice. And Tutu reminded such critics that a decisive Nuremberg-type solution would never have worked. For while the Allies could pack up and go home after Nuremberg, he said, we in South Africa still had to live with one another. The Chief Justice of South African Constitutional Court, Judge Ismail Mohammed, offered this particular perspective. If the Constitution kept alive the prospect of continuous retaliation and revenge, the agreement of those threatened by its implementation might never have been forthcoming. Tutu also makes the point that as a poor country, South Africa simply did not have the financial resources to prosecute an unending series of human rights abuses. The ANC was eager to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, partly because it had already authorized something similar for its own members. Recognizing that the ANC itself was imperfect and that injustices had occurred within its own ranks, particularly in its military camps, which were set up in countries bordering South Africa, the African National Congress had previously established inquiries to examine and punish abuses by its own leaders. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been accused of being not just forgiving, but too lax and indulgent in its treatment of serious criminal offenses. The Commission clearly valued truth over punishment. It demanded full disclosure of crimes, but did not require expressions of regret or acts of penance. However, the TRC only offered amnesty for political crimes. Any crime that had any type of personal or financial or other motivations would not be eligible for immunity. And Tutu pointed out that even though public confessions could result in amnesty, guilty parties did not escape punishment or judgment. Many members of the security forces lost their jobs and the love and support of friends and family when they finally admitted to being part of the secret death squads which carried out clandestine executions of South Africans who were simply advocating for their freedoms. And amnesty was not granted for all political crimes. The type of amnesty offered by the TRC would not, for example, be allowed in perpetuity. The TRC's existence was deemed necessary in the short term, but human rights abuses in the 21st century will be punished without criminal penalties. And so defending the TRC against that it was turning a blind eye to injustice, the Archbishop argued that the TRC prohibited retributive justice, but not restorative justice. Instead of punishment, Ubuntu's concern is with the healing of breaches and the redressing of imbalances, the restoration of a broken relationship, and a seeking of rehabilitation of both the victim and the perpetrator, who should be given the opportunity to be reintegrated into the community that has been injured by his or her offenses. Tutu acknowledges that despite all that was accomplished by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a high price had to be paid by victims and their families. As soon as amnesty was granted, the criminal record of the perpetrator was expunged. And as a result, families who had lost loved ones to state violence could never sue for negligence or compensation. And he did mourn the burden this placed on the victim, but he considered that this price had to be paid for a liberated South Africa to enjoy a future of peace and prosperity. And since victims and their families would never be able to sue perpetrators for damages after perpetrators were granted amnesty, the TRC recommended that the government develop a policy of reparations for those who had suffered physical, monetary, and emotional devastation under apartheid. Such policies was thought to be more just and far more comprehensive than having individual families sue various political officers or government officials. And because the apartheid had left a legacy in which blacks would continue to suffer from destitution, a lack to adequate education and healthcare and housing, the TRC argued that ameliorating these problems was the best way for the new government to atone for the sins of the past. Some individuals who had experienced particular atrocious treatment were offered compensatory damages. And though there were many debates about the proper amount for such restitution, the sums were usually quite modest and ranging from one-time payment of $300 to an annual payment of $4,000 that would end after 5 to 6 years. The requests made to the TRC by individual families were often much more humble than that. It was common for applicants simply to request assistance with the cost of funerals, of schooling, and of medical care. Tutu reminds us that there is greater rejoicing in heaven over a repentant sinner than for those virtuous souls who required no such repentance. And he insisted that Christians are constrained by the imperative of the gospel, the good news of a God who has a bias for sinners contrary to the normal standards of the world. Therefore, in his eyes, no one who is irredeemable, and there are hopeful prospects for every single person without exception. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided a forum for victimized South Africans and their families to tell their stories. And though their personal testimony might not have been sufficiently verifiable or admissible in the court, the ability for the first time to publicly air stories of state-sanctioned killings and detention proved a much deeper healing to many in disenfranchised communities who had never before been allowed a public voice. Though harsh and punitive measures were rejected, many leaders of the apartheid state argued for the Truth and Reconciliation to take an even more lenient approach. And they suggested that a blanket amnesty be offered for all human rights abuses which had occurred between 1948 and 1994. And a model of this type of immunity already existed in Chile, where the dictator Augusto Pinochet gave himself and all his accomplices exemption from prosecution for the thousands of politically motivated killings. South Africa rejected a blanket amnesty, believing it is inappropriate for apartheid leaders to absolve themselves without ever having to make a public account of their actions. Tutu felt that a national amnesia about the sins of apartheid could never provide South Africa with the requisite healing and harmony. So why did this happen in South Africa when it did? Tutu recalls the words of the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Galatians, which describes the incarnation as occurring in the fullness of time. That is, when the right time had come. Just as Jesus' life and ministry could not have occurred at any time other than the right moment, Tutu argues that the sweeping geopolitical forces had coalesced in order for apartheid to end. Previous presidents would never have made concessions to the ANC, but in 1990, President de Klerk shocked the country and his own political allies when he announced to Parliament that the African National Congress would no longer be banned. And he further announced that the dozens of political prisoners would be free from prison, and indeed Nelson Mandela was released a week later. In addition, all executions would be immediately suspended, ending a long tradition of motivated hangings. And so for Tutu, this was the fullness of time for a decisive and radical change in South Africa. Nelson Mandela also, perhaps miraculously, was able to exhibit the spirit of Ubuntu He was not embittered or vengeful after his 27 years in prison. And Mandela understood that it was in the best interest of Black South Africans to recognize their common humanity with their white oppressors. His stature as an international community and the reverence with which he was held by Black South Africans meant that if he had wished, he could have dictated his terms to the apartheid regime. But instead, Mandela led his political party and his country toward conciliation with the white government. And he did so despite calls from some quarters for a much harsher reckoning and severe punishment. So in the end, Tutu embodied what it meant to be a repairer of the breach. Not only did he serve as a repairer of the breach, but offered himself as a living sacrifice for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of justice, and for the sake of peace. And of course, there will always be naysayers claiming that he was naive and that he was too ready to forgive. However, the personal cost to him and his family was immense. He not only preached forgiveness and reconciliation, but he also lived it in his witness to the truth, believing that he had no other choice if he was to take seriously the tenets of his faith. And I will end there.
Thank you, Richard. I am going to open it up to some questions and answer. We have a little bit of time here. If you'll see at the bottom of your screen where all of your controls are, there's a little Q&A box. It has a question mark in it. Feel free to click on that. I'll give it a little while so some folks can get some questions started. And once those start rolling in, we will head it back over to Father Cogill to get some questions answered. So feel free to drop any questions there in the Q&A box. While you're working on that, I'll just go ahead and you'll see up here on your screen our upcoming lectures and events from the School of Theology. I'm actually also going to go ahead and drop into the chat a link directly to that portal, and that will take you to you can register for any of these events. Our next two events that are directly coming up, we have a webinar next week with the director of EFM, Kevin Goodman, talking about EFM in the next 50 years. And then our final lunch and learn for the semester is also next week on the 3rd with the dean, with Jim Terrell. So I will leave those for you. Also in that portal, you'll see some links to some other hybrid lectures that we're having that will be available in person, but also online. Any questions you have, you can go ahead and drop them in that Q&A box. What are some, do you have any suggestions for materials or any sort of follow-up resources for folks?
In terms of?
Books or any sort of resource for further research or further information?
A number of one of the books that I often recommend is Archbishop Tutu's book, No Freedom Without Forgiveness, in which he articulates his theological imagination around this whole TRC process. The whole Truth and Reconciliation will make available, I think, this year, all of the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation, and resources will also be available for that, so that people can log in to the TRC website to get a more expansive bibliography that they can use.
Great. Do you see this restorative justice as a model for how we live in community and engage with others who may be oppressors or the oppressed? And if so, how so?
It's really interesting. I mean, we have this our notion of an eye for an eye, and so it's always the powerful that dominates. as Christians, and particularly within Tuti's imagination and in my imagination, um, that when we are advocating as Christians a different way of being in community, for the greater good, we cannot simply dismiss the humanity of the other, or we cannot say, I have no need of you. That the obligation that we commit to as Christians, even within our baptismal vows, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons without exception, mean that we cannot simply dismiss people as depraved or with a different political ideology, that ours as Christians is a commitment to be in relationship even when it is difficult, and even when there is a price to pay.
How did Archbishop Tutu's personal spiritual practices influence his witness?
A very good question. You know, I worked with the Archbishop, and he was my mentor. And so later in his life, he would say Mass at 7 o'clock every day in the morning, and I would assist him at the cathedral. Um, for Archbishop Tutu, his faith was central to his political convictions. He was a man of deep faith. I remember when he made a trip to the United States. And so he would get up at 4 a.m. every day and pray for those who hate him by name. And at between 2 and 4 will be his time with God in the afternoon. And he came to the United States, and Condoleezza Rice had called up the Archbishop's assistant and said, "Oh, President Bush would like to speak to the Archbishop." And the answer was, he's praying, call back at 5 o'clock. So not even the President of the United States could detract him from God's business. And so for him, the Eucharist was central to his spirituality. He had communion every single day. And even when he was in hospital and I would offer to bring him communion from the reserved sacrament, he didn't want that. He wanted me to say Mass in his hospital bed, because for him, it was not just an assent to some commonly held beliefs. It was a deep commitment in his faith journey, that everything he did was because of his faith in God and who he understood God to be.
What was the rationale for changing from truth and reconciliation to
Mhm.
truth to power?
Where was this? In South Africa?
Pardon?
Is it going from one to the other or other to the other? From
The question just says, what was the rationale for changing from truth and reconciliation to truth to power?
I mean, the idea of truth and reconciliation, which is at the core of our sense of the common life and the common good in South Africa, still prevails largely within the theological and religious establishment. This notion of the seduction of power, the dominance, the victor, um, is a different way of being that we reject. And so we are adamant that as Christians, that reconciliation is integral to the gospel message, and it's not just an optional extra. It is the vocation of every single Christian person seeking to recognize God in the other. So it's not this. It's very interesting that within our culture, the well-being of the other becomes crucial. It's not about me, myself, and I, but it is about enhancing the common good. So that in some of the very traditional and rural areas, even to this day, when there is a rich person in the community, it is incumbent on them to host a community-wide feast, a party, at least once a year, so that those less fortunate do not envy the wealth of the person with the wealth. So the sense of for otherness is both at the heart of the gospel, at the heart of the Trinity, but also at what we aspire to as Christians in this day and age.
I think we have time for a couple of more. How can Ubuntu inform our concept of restorative justice as an animus for action today?
Lovely, lovely. That's a good question. I mean, we find ourselves often, I mean, our common disposition is an eye for an eye. Mm. And so our sense of fairness and our sense of justice uh, is affronted by this notion that the perpetrator has value. Mm. Um, that in our teaching and in our churches, in the way we form people, and the way we preach the gospel, not as a nice thing to have, but an absolute commitment to a yet more excellent way. Hmm? I was listening the other day to a preacher saying, um, if Jesus had lived today, he won't be riding a donkey. He'd be in a jet plane and private plane, and the co-opting of values that are contrary to the reign of God, to the kingdom of God, um, is in some ways the church being taken hostage by the dominant paradigm. And how do we as church then subvert that and go back to those gospel values of the greater good? So it is not an orientation simply because we're trying to be nice. It is rooted in the imperative um, that we have no other choice. Huh? What does the reign of God look like? And how do we preach the reign of God in tangible ways, not just an assent to commonly held beliefs, but to wanting to usher in a new way of being? And that begins in our tiny little congregations and how we do Christian formation.
Thank you. I do believe that's all the time that we have for today. We do still have a couple of questions. Richard, I can share those with you, and if you'd like, we can reach out to folks because I just
Absolutely.
don't think that we're going to have enough time today. But I do thank everybody for being here. Like I said, visit that link in the chat. Join us for some other events. We have a couple of more happening this semester, and we hope to see you there. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.